Hello, Internet. It's Daniel with Driving and Dragons, and today I'm just going to go over 5 quick tips on how you can use history as a game master, either in crafting those one shots that you got to come up with out of the top of your mind for that game you didn't know was going to happen, or for the building of your campaign, creation of characters and memorable NPCs, and just general use in your game. Players pay attention to, because some of these tips can be quite useful in character creation to make something unique and memorable. See you on the other side. So 5 ways to use history in your game as a resource, either in character creation or campaign creation, world building, event planning, that sort of thing. How can we use historical events that we all know and love as a way to spice up our game and make our job, either as a player or a game master, a little bit easier? Let's start with number 1. That is anachronism. Now, anachronism is defined as something being out of place in time. This would be like seeing a cell phone in a sitcom featured in the 1970s. This is an anachronism. The great example in classical fantasy style literature would be like the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, where the modern man gets transported back to ye olde England. You can use this pretty easily in your games as well. For instance, you could take an event like Sherman's March to the Sea from the American Civil War and take this piece, look at his plot line as he went from Tennessee down to Atlanta, through over to Savannah and up the coast till he got to Columbia, South Carolina, which he burned to the ground. You can read even just a brief synopsis of this. This has become your orc invasion. Oh, it's so devastating. It can even be a human versus human, or a good race versus good race, in a way that you can show more vicious natures by saying, okay, well, the elves and the humans are at war, and the elves, the way we know they're not playing around anymore is now they're slash and burn, they're scorched earth, they're destroying the supply lines, they're slaughtering the horses, they're burning the carts, they're destroying the towns, they're setting the granaries on fire, they're turning the people out of their homes in their warpath as they cut off the supply line for the human armies. This is literally just taking something and moving it into a more appropriate setting for your game. And it can be anything. It can be something as small as taking a great general like Napoleon and using his personality and tactics to create a baron or a lord or a general in your game, all the way up to introducing something that would mimic modern technology in your fantasy role-playing game setting. Number 2 is compression. Now, compression is when we're going to take a series of events and we're going to smush them together. We're going to make them closer in nature than they were before. Now, what this can do for helping you create a campaign is history in our world and in real life tends to be a longer thing than we actually think of in terms of our games. For instance, World War II was a decade. The Saxon conquest of Britain, for instance, lasted from 410 to 1066, although the Saxon period did. And it was 410 till about 850 when it went from Saxon invaders establishing coastal colonies and pushing into Wales and the British nations, until it was the kingdoms of Sussex and Wessex and Mercia and Northumbria, and the Welsh and the other native Britons were relegated to relatively small communities. This can be something you can take into your game and compress these timelines. This can also be used in character creation. You take a character, a figure from history, and you kind of compress their life down into something that makes a more memorable character. You take some of the core parts of their life, key events, you compress the time frame on that, you fold them all into a character, and now you have a Julius Caesar who doesn't have to be 40 years old and have all of his military experience, but can have a lot of his other experiences in life that, that justify him as a character that you've brought in. So that is compression, taking the historical time period, smushing it down from 440 years to maybe a couple of years, and now you've got your orc invasion of the region. Number 3 is inversion. Inversion is taking something, and exactly like it sounds, we're going to flip it upside down. We're going to turn it on its head. We're going to take something that is known and make it unknown simply by flipping the script a little bit on it. We're going to make some minor adjustments, and we're going to look at it from the perspective that's not normally looked at. So for instance, most of us are going to be Western civilizations, and we are going to have been raised and educated from a Western perspective, from a kind of a European perspective in a lot of ways. So when we look at things, we look at it from a Western civilization perspective, and we can kind of flip those things around. Let's take, for instance, the story of the 300 Spartans and their stand at Thermopylae. This is a very well-known story, especially amongst gamers, because we've watched the movies and read the graphic novels and, then looked back into it because it's one of those cool military history things that we all know about, and, the great few standing against many and all that kind of jazz. But how about we have an opposing force that has blocked up a narrow passageway, and you as a party have to find some way that you can get the good guys through for the relief, so that you can break through and liberate the conquered land, because the goblin horde or whatever has managed to block off this narrow passage and you can't get through them. So now we've taken 300, where instead of the 300 being the noble heroes filling the gap and buying the Greeks time so that they can defeat the Persians and keep the Persians out of Greece, now we're kind of on the side of the Persians. We need to get in there, and they've got us holed up, and we got to figure out that goat path that's around the backside. So that would be inverting the scenario from what we've normally known. Number 4, small impact on the big picture. One thing that you stay away from as a student of history is a thing called big man history or great man history. We understand that, with very, very limited exception, Napoleon being the biggest one, history is not made by an individual. An individual just happens to be the vehicle through which events happen. Things were already going in that direction. For instance, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand is seen pretty much universally as the match that set off the powder keg of the Balkans and kicked off World War I. But anybody who was looking at it realized that was going to happen anyway. Something was going to set it off. If there was no Archduke Ferdinand, if there was no Black Hand, if there was no Serbian assassination plot, something was still going to result in that happening. That war was going to happen. The last 100 years of history and the network of alliances, kind of ironically going all the way back to Napoleon, all of those little things were going to cause it to happen. When I make a campaign, and a piece of advice I give people when they're writing a campaign is that your world, to be a believable lived-in world, it needs to have that. You need to have that big major historical narrative there, and your players do not influence that. They don't change that overall course of history. Yeah, it's kind of cool to have the idea of, our character stood up and they changed the course of history. Maybe. At the most, they delay history a few years. Because no matter how powerful your characters are, unless you're getting up into the 20th level god wizards that can warp time and reality, your party is not going to have, no individual group of characters is going to have that massive influence on the overall course of events in the story. However, what you can do is make sure that when those major events happen and the players are kind of on the sidelines watching how the world events turn, they can see the impact of their small adventures. So they go off and they do a couple of adventures, and it doesn't change the fact that the city falls. But maybe somebody escapes. Maybe some treasures are not there. Maybe they see the evil baron is totally frustrated because that one thing that they went and got out of the great crown or the legendary sword slipped through his grasp, even though he still took the city. But because of the players' actions, they can see those small impacts. So write your campaign with the big picture in mind that the players have minimal influence on, but allow the events to stamp their mark on those happenings. And number 5, and this one is the easiest of them all, is straight up theft. Steal, 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 baby. If you want to have something crazy, you can reach right in there and pull it out of the goodie bag. And even if the players as a matter of fact, a lot of times if the players recognize it, it may actually be a good thing that heightens their view of the scenario or the situation because they already have an idea in their head. So for instance, I got a city that's been sacked by evil creatures, a demon army. Who knows what it is? Demon army is a good one for this. And this city has been trashed, and I'm trying to convey the idea of how bad this is. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to think back, and I'm going to think of, say, the sack of Rome in 1527, when the Protestant mercenaries, whose overall leader was basically dead and they were facing not getting paid, break into the wealthiest city in the world, into Rome, and just start massacring the cardinals and the bishops and the nuns and the priests, and just destroying Rome and taking everything of value they possibly can, behaving in the worst ways possible. I don't have to think up all the disgusting, terrible things. All I have to do is look at history, because you got all kinds of crazy stuff that happened in the sack of Rome. For instance, during the sack of Rome in 1527, you had a priest who was dragged to a church, and they tried to force him to give holy sacraments to a donkey that had been dressed up in vestments. And when he refused to do it, they just executed him. There's plenty of stuff like that in there that can add flavor to your view. You could have the elven capital that's been captured, and the cleric of Corellin Laerthane being led around with a rope around his testicles before he's forced to try and bless some kind of donkey or something and is executed for his trouble. And it's straight up ripped off out of history, because you are ripping off something that is well known that your players may have some familiarity with. The ones who do have that familiarity, they're going to pick up on it, and they're going to start writing their own descriptions in their head. They're going to be thinking about stuff that you never even described on how horrible that situation is. And it can be done with just about anything, whether it's triumphant, whether it's horrible, whether it's terrifying, whether it's a sad thing. If you can pick out a moment in history that elicited what you wanted and is close enough to it, straight up rip it off. So there you go. That's the 5: anachronism, compression, inversion, small impact on the big picture, and straight up theft. Let me know down in the comment section below what you think about using history in your games. Maybe we can help do things just a little bit better. See you next time.